And Sarah, you're muted.
Great, thank you for letting me know. Welcome to our webinar today, everyone. Academic Integrity in Online Courses, Adapting During COVID-19. Sarah Elaine Eaton from the University of Calgary. Glad to have everyone here with us today. And I'm joined by my colleague and co-pilot for today, Dr. Katie Crossman, and she will be monitoring the chat box for us today. Katie, did you want to turn on your camera or say hello to the folks to let them know that you'll be doing the chat?
Sure. My name is Katie Crossman. I don't see myself on the screen, but I'm here, I'm in Calgary, and I'll monitor the chat box. So if you have any questions, just type them into the chat window, and and I'll try to ask them at the best possible time. So that might mean saving them till later, or it might mean interrupting and asking Sarah at the moment. If I can answer them directly right away, I will do so in the chat box. I'm glad to see everyone, and I'm happy to be here.
Great. Thanks so much for that, and I really appreciate you being here today to monitor the chat box. Looks like we have about 84 people who are with us in real time. So in the interest of transparency, again, this session will be recorded, and the recording will be shared with all of those who are registered. And I think it will also be shared through the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning website. And thank you to the TI, as we call them at the University of Calgary, for supporting this webinar and my campus-wide work for academic integrity. So we've done a little bit of the housekeeping around the chat box. We'll be using the chat box for your questions and comments throughout the session. I encourage you to interact. And we won't be using mics during the session. So unlike a typical online class where we would have lots of dialogue and back and forth, because I didn't know who was signing in from today, I didn't get a registration list before the session because people were literally registering until about quarter to the hour. And I think that we have folks here. I know we have folks from at least across Canada, and it looks like we have some folks from the US. If you haven't already chimed in to let us know where you're signing in from today, we would love to know. I heard that there might also be a couple of folks from the UK. We'll use the chat box for you to connect with Katie and with me through this session. You'll notice on the slides that there's a footnote on all of the slides. That's a little bit of a citation because in addition to the recording, you have my permission to take screenshots, if you like, of any and all the slides. I'm happy to make the slide decks available afterwards. I know that some of you, I'm just going to mute some of the folks that have their microphones on. Katie, could you go ahead and mute those folks for me as the co-host? Thanks. You have my permission to take screenshots of any of the slides if you don't want to wait for the slide deck, okay? I like to make that available to folks throughout the session. So I'm coming to you today wearing my educational leader in residence hat. This is part of a suite of 3 roles at the University of Calgary. And there are, my portfolio is academic integrity, and I'm joined by 2 colleagues, one of whom provides campus support for online learning, and the other provides campus support for grad supervision and mentorship. So needless to say, we've all been very busy the past couple of weeks as we are supporting our colleagues, friends, students, staff, as we move to new ways of teaching and learning on a campus-wide, institution-wide level. So this is fairly new. Bit of a background on me. I joined the Workland School of Education full-time in 2016. Prior to that, I was what's known in Canada as a sessional, might be an adjunct in the United States or a lecturer in the UK. I did that for 22 years. During which time I taught mostly online for different schools and institutions, University of Calgary, some other schools here in town. I also did a short stint with Idaho State University teaching online, and gave my first webinar in 2005. And also taught a lot for continuing education. I lost track when I hit about 100 online courses, so I've been in the game for a long time. And continue to teach online now that I have my full-time role. So this was like the perfect storm when it came to academic integrity and online learning, because it is quite different. Learning, teaching online is quite different from a classroom practice. In fact, personal anecdote, a couple of years ago, I was assigned a course to teach in the graduate programs in education that I had been teaching online for I don't know, about 10 years. It was a research methods course for our master's students. And I really had to wrap my brain around, how am I going to transfer this back into a classroom format? Because I'd only ever taught it online. So it can go both ways. But if you're brand new to this game, I can appreciate that this is hurting your brain, and hopefully it can provide some support today for academic integrity. A little bit of background and context on this particular session today. This session was planned in early January, before we had even heard about anything about COVID-19. It was originally planned with our colleagues in the Schulich School of Engineering. So welcome if there's any engineers joining us today. This was originally planned as a face-to-face workshop and was attached to a scholarship of teaching and learning project that we had with the folks over there in engineering. So if we have the associate deans here from engineering, and we had a research assistant as well, Rob and Paul, and of course we had Katie Crossman, who's our Senior Research Associate for Academic Integrity on campus. So we pivoted very quickly, not only with our classes, but also with this workshop, moving it from a classroom-based workshop or a face-to-face workshop online. Then it got expanded to the entire campus community. Then it got expanded to broader campus engagement. So some of the content, I've tried to ensure that there's content that's relevant for our University of Calgary campus community who's been looking forward to this for a couple of months, but also relevant for those of you who are joining us from other jurisdictions as well. Okay. We have learning objectives for all of our workshops through the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, and one of the objectives have also shifted given that the workshop has shifted. So it's looking at how academic integrity works in online classes. We want to talk a little bit about predatory contract cheating and what that means and how to be aware of it as you're moving your classes online. Give you some practical ideas and talk a little bit about assessment, and that you as an educator can gain some confidence and some calmness as you provide teaching continuity to your students. I know that we're all in a very responsive mode right now, and we're doing the best we can, and I trust that you're doing the best you can as well. So those are the objectives for today. I will say that there are no silver bullets, right? There's no magic formula, and that as you're transferring things online, there are things that you can do to help promote teaching and learning, which is the perspective that I take. In terms of who is the webinar for, well, it was originally designed for academic colleagues and teaching assistants in our engineering school, but it's mostly for those who are new to online teaching, faculty, teaching assistants, those who are in roles who are supporting students, and it could also be higher education professionals, etc. Those who are interested in academic integrity and committed to upholding it and enacting it in your classes, but you may not have a professional or research background in academic integrity. If you are already deeply embedded in our academic integrity community, you are absolutely welcome to join us, though I won't promise that you'll learn very much that's new. So I wanted to kind of frame the session for the audience before we get into the content. So again, sort of thinking through this through a lens of who might be new to academic integrity. Most of our policies talk about academic misconduct and dishonesty, or at least they still do at University of Calgary. The shift towards academic integrity started I say actively in the 1990s because of the work of Don McCabe, the late Don McCabe, who was instrumental in helping institutions across Canada, the United States, and other countries move away from a deficit mindset of academic misconduct towards more of a strength-based approach around academic integrity. And together with his colleagues, he literally changed the narrative around academic integrity for policy, research, and teaching and learning as well, and started conversations around how integrity is rooted in values, whereas misconduct is rooted in behavior. So when it comes to many of our policies, they still address the behavior, and we don't sanction people for having bad values. We sanction them for doing bad things. And so the tensions that exist between enacting those values and upholding our policies come into play every day, I think, as well, and will continue to. By focusing on integrity, then we shift the ethical decision making, which is this, I always like to say it's a skill students need after they graduate. And I'm situated academically, my academic home is the School of Education. And so like engineering, social work, nursing, education. In some ways, we have an easier sell for academic integrity because we can say that academic integrity in the classroom is rooted, it's the foundation for professional ethical practice after students graduate. You'll see throughout the slides that I've included some references to what I'm talking about. And then as I talk, you see that I don't rehearse my slides before I go through them. Some things will occur to me. So when I say things like, there is research to show that academic integrity is linked to ethical practice. I'm thinking of the work in particular of Zubin Austin that came out in 2005, 2006, where they looked at some pharmacy students and at the University of Toronto, actually. And found that there was misconduct that was admitted to, but both by students and by faculty. Faculty admitted in that study, the two studies that Austin did with his colleagues, that they had committed misconduct when they were students, but they found it more reprehensible and more serious when they became faculty members. And there are others who sort of joined in that dialogue as well, thinking about academic integrity from a developmental standpoint. This is one of the key messages I like to share with people who are new to this work. We sometimes hear, oh, I don't have time to teach this. I have to focus on my content, and that this is somehow, we somehow expect students to come to our campuses from high school knowing what to do or how to enact integrity. And there's lots of evidence to support that just as students don't come to our campuses knowing advanced calculus or quantum physics or having read Chaucer or anything that's deep disciplinary knowledge, that deep knowledge around moral development continues for most of us when we're in our 20s. And so I see academic integrity as developmental. And it includes things like values and understanding behaviors and understanding expectations. So the idea that students should know what they need to do is kind of like saying they should know how to do advanced physics or how to, I don't know, read Beowulf and understand it when they get to campus. They don't. And part of their work on campus is, and our work, is helping them acculturate to the academic norms that later become their professional norms. So misconduct is often still used in our policy language. The International Center for Academic Integrity was started by the late Don McCabe and continues to exist today and provide lots and lots of support, professional development opportunities. In fact, they gave a webinar last week on academic integrity, and that recording is also available. So if you would like that, we can certainly give you the link to it if you like. Maybe drop a note in the chat box for Katie, and we can take down anybody's information that wants a link to that. So here are the 6 values that they started with 5 and then added courage at the end, but courage, fairness, honesty, responsibility, respect, trust. These are the values that underpin academic integrity and that we try to enact. When I look at these, I'm always cautious to say the values are not absolute. And the one that I like to kind of highlight and pick out is around responsibility. So it's very easy to say students have a responsibility not to cheat. Students have a responsibility to know the rules. We have a responsibility to treat students fairly, for example. But there's another sort of angle on responsibility that I wanted to bring up. Sometimes students in certain social groups or contexts have a responsibility to help fellow members of their social group. So this often gets sort of translated and mutated in ways that I think today are kind of racist, say, oh, students from that country or that group, they all have to help each other. However, in some of the research that Don McCabe did, particularly in his 2012 book that he wrote with Butterfield and Trevino, they talked about how some of the early research around student sharing was actually found among fraternities and sororities in the United States. Now, I don't mean to suggest that members of Greek societies are inherently, engage in more misconduct. There was found to be more misconduct among that particular social group, and that there were things known as frat files or test files, and the social groups retained file boxes where members of the society would input they would actually, their old paper tests, right? This was found in the 70s and 60s, old copies of papers, old copies of tests, and then subsequent members would be able to come in, or current members would be able to come in and check through the files and could find a copy of a paper or a test and refer to it. So the notion of file sharing on American campuses was first found among primarily American middle-class students. So I think it's really important to avoid stereotyping particular groups of students. Again, I know that Greek societies also do a lot of good work and provide a lot of good support for their members. So that was an example to highlight how responsibility can shift and is not an absolute thing. And those are sort of also some of the early indicators of file sharing that we've seen go online in later times. Now closed student groups will often operate through, WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, Google Docs, etc. So the notion of student file sharing is not new. And the sense of students needing to give back to their social communities in that way. I'm not a sociologist, but as a small social group, I think it would be a fascinating thing to study. But anyway, these are the values, and we think about how do we enact these values. So those of us who study this work look at it through a variety of different lenses. So Adam had a book chapter in the International Handbook for Academic Integrity. And I took Lee Adams' narrative and put it into this Venn diagram. These are sort of the lenses that we can look at academic integrity through. Traditionally, it's been seen through either a moral lens or later a policy lens. In the first half of the 20th century, the moral psychologists studied academic cheating a lot. Exam cheating, and then what makes a good person, the moral development models were examined a lot and still are. In the work that I do, we encourage people and to avoid moral binaries and ethical binaries. The world is not divided into people who cheat and people who do not cheat, right? That is a key message that I want to share in this webinar, particularly if you're moving online. To kind of, understand even in criminal behavior that there's a continuum of severity, right? So there's a difference between the person who runs a red light and gets a ticket and the person who is a serial murderer and kills their family. So there are degrees of severity. And those, I'm speaking a little bit in hyperbole there, but to kind of drive the point home that we want to avoid moral binaries. And we also know that contextual factors can come into play. Things such as students under stress levels can come into play. First-year students might be more at risk of engaging in misconduct, etc. Then we look at policy issues. In Canada, at least, we're a country that's privileged to have policies and procedures around this, and policy will often focus on misconduct as well. I'm a bit of a policy head, and so I actually like to study academic integrity policy and have done some collaborative work with some wonderful colleagues in Canada around looking at what do Canadian institutions say and do when it comes to their academic integrity policy. Then there's the teaching and learning issue, or the lens that how do we help our students learn, right? And I'll come back to that because this is kind of how I wanted to frame today. So for the benefit of the University of Calgary colleagues and any other policy heads that are out there, Katie, maybe you could put the links to the academic misconduct policy and procedure in the chat box for anyone who wants them. We have a relatively new set of policies and procedures at the University of Calgary. They're available to anyone who wants to have a look at them. Of course, we ask our academic staff to know what's in the policy and procedure. I still talk to many people that don't know that we have new policies as of last year. And so I would encourage you to have a look at them. Thanks, Katie, for adding those links there. A really important but subtle shift happened when we got new policies, and that was we moved away from having everything be the student's responsibility, right? So remember when I talked about that responsibility as a value, it used to be for us at the University of Calgary that everything was the student's responsibility. It is the student's responsibility to know the policy and procedure. It was the student's responsibility to not cheat. Now we have a shared responsibility model in which students have responsibilities, administrators have responsibilities, and educators have responsibilities. And by educators, I mean academic staff, and TAs, teaching assistants in those courses. So we now all have responsibilities, and those are articulated in our policies and procedures. And we've also expanded and updated some of our definitions. So that shift really is important because it kind of puts a new onus on people who may not have felt it before around understanding what are our responsibilities as faculty members, principally, to help ensure that students uphold integrity. And that does not just mean reporting them when there is a misconduct, but also in terms of pedagogy and prevention. And we have that now as part of our framework. And I'll just take a little pause here and say, we have something in our policies and procedures that someone was emailing me about this morning, and it was about student reporting. I will say we do have a section in our policies around students reporting if they want to, but students are not required to report anybody for academic misconduct at the University of Calgary. As we're thinking about shifting our ways of teaching and learning for academic integrity, I'm encouraging everyone, no matter where you're from, to work within your established systems and your institutional culture. So for example, University of Calgary does not have any institutional licensing for text matching software. We don't have Turnitin, for example, and we don't have any online exam proctoring. So we are in a situation in our province right now where prior to the coronavirus crisis, we have had a financial crisis that has affected all of our post-secondaries across the board. And we will not be getting any new institutional level licenses for new technologies to the best of my knowledge. So for example, we will not be getting Turnitin or ProctorU or new technologies during this time. To the best of my knowledge, I know that our administration is very responsive and receptive, but I'm sharing with you what I know at this time so that if questions come forward like, oh, are we going to get ProctorU? The answer is not to the best of my knowledge. So we will be working within our existing system. So what can we do with what we have to support our students is the question I'm posing and also helping to try and answer. Other questions I've had come to me are things like, oh, do we need an honor code? Honor codes are deeply embedded as part of some American universities and part of American academic integrity culture. Don McCabe, the late Don McCabe, was a big advocate of honor codes, though in the 2012 book that I referenced at the end that he wrote with McCabe, McCabe, Butterfield, and Trevino, they noted that an institution can have an honor culture without having an honor code. Canadian schools do not have honor codes, and honor codes in American schools, as far as I know, they are part of an institutional approach to academic integrity and honor student conduct that it starts with an induction from the day the student sets foot on campus, perhaps even before. It is repeated. It's an entire induction process throughout this and acculturation process throughout the student's schooling. Very different in operations and governance than what we have in Canada. So for example, at my university, if there's a misconduct, it is not dealt with by a student honor council. It's not the students who decide the sanctions, it's an administrator, it's an associate dean. It's important to understand that honor codes are underpinned by an entire approach to academic integrity that is quite different from what most schools have in Canada. So it's not reasonable to suddenly think, oh, well, we need an honor code. Like, what do you already have at your institution that's part of your honor culture? And how do you pull on those existing threads of integrity that you have for your students? What are the established systems, policies, and procedures that you can already draw on? If you're coming in from a Canadian school, you probably have something, and now might be a time to figure out, okay, what do I have and what can I use to help me? And how do you align what you're doing within your existing teaching systems, institutional systems? So for example, when I had someone contact me today and say, I want to be able to point to the place in the policy that tells students they're obliged to report other students for cheating, I was able to come back and say, you want to look at section 4.6 of the procedure. Students are not obliged to report other students for cheating. If they wish to, there is a mechanism for them to be able to do that, but it's not, we cannot start requiring students to rat out each other. And there is research to show that students don't rat out each other. And so that's not something new that we'll be starting because we're moving online. We will not be asking students to become the plagiarism police for each other, for example. Before I go on with any other slides, I'm going to take a little pause, and Katie asks, do we have any questions that I've missed in the chat box?
Hi, Sarah. I don't think that there's anything that's um, super relevant right now, although there were a couple questions just about the mechanics of using online proctoring and whether or not instructors have to be watching at that time if they're using some sort of program like ProctorU.
Okay, I might not be able to address right now, but I'm going to put my email address in the chat box there because we had a webinar on that a couple of weeks ago. Our generous colleagues from Thompson Rivers University gave us about a 90-minute webinar on the nuts and bolts of using a service like ProctorU. They use ProctorU at Thompson Rivers University, and they went through everything from can students eat and drink if they use ProctorU to how much does it cost. So we can make that webinar recording available to everyone. And again, it's another Canadian university, so it might be particularly relevant for those who are joining in from Canadian schools.
Okay, I have a link
yeah.
to that one, so I can put that
great.
into the chat window,
Yeah.
and it also addresses Nick Cheng's question about bathroom breaks.
Okay, terrific. Yes, thank you for doing that. Okay, I'll carry on then. Okay, so many of you who are academic integrity advocates will be familiar with the work of Tricia Bertram-Gallant. Many of us refer to her work, especially the 2008 book on academic integrity being a teaching and learning imperative. And she asks us to reframe the question, why are students cheating, to how do we ensure students are learning? This, I think, is a really, she wrote that question in that book in 2008, 12 years ago. And I think now more than ever, that question has deep, deep importance. I have been personally very troubled when I've encountered fellow faculty members who are very frustrated about what they see as being increasing levels of cheating in online courses and sort of the general narrative around academic integrity on their campuses. So I will leave this as a key question for you to ponder. If you recall back to the beginning of the session, I gave you permission to take screenshots of any slides, and this would be a good one to take a screenshot of if you don't already have the question in your brain, and send that slide around to others in your department if you like. Because this is basically the focus of what we want to do when we're thinking about assessment in online courses. A little bit of myth busting. Students do not cheat more in online classes. That is a myth. We have about 20 years of research to support it. I've put some of the citations on the screen. The most recent one was from a group out of the US, Harris et al. They surveyed about, gosh, I think it was thousands and thousands of online students. It's principally a large online school in the US. And one of the things they found that others before them had found was that there was not necessarily more cheating in online courses. However, the nature of the cheating or the misconduct can change. So there can be increases in unauthorized use of materials. So crib notes, for example, cheat sheets, downloading answers. This becomes important when we think about assessments, because if we're creating the kinds of assessments that make it easy for students to download answers, share answers, that kind of thing, then we're creating opportunities for them. There might also be more use of unauthorized third parties. So in plain language, this is academic outsourcing or contract cheating. We know that this happens more in online classes. It doesn't mean that all cheating happens more. And I really want to bust the myth that just because students are moving to an online environment means they're suddenly going to become cheaters, right? Your students also have moral compasses. They also want to learn. They may be in extremely stressful situations themselves. So I just want to emphasize and bust that myth, and also put the research up there to show you that if you want to, you can go back now almost 20 years to Scallon's work, 2002. That was pretty seminal at the time, to show that no, this is not true. It is one of those myths. It's kind of like another one of the myths. I'll leave it for the side today, but international students cheat more. There is research to show that international students are overrepresented in cheating reports. So the analogy I have for that is an imperfect one, but it sometimes helps to drive the point home that sometimes Indigenous populations are overrepresented in Canada's jails. Does not mean that more Indigenous people are committing crimes means they might be subject to racial profiling, they might be caught more often, punished more harshly. There's evidence and mounting evidence to show it's the same with our international students, particularly if those students are not white and if English is not their native language. So I'll leave that to the side as an additional bit of myth busting now, but I will say I have been troubled by the amount of increased racism as well that I've heard, that one, if students go online and if they're students from a particular place, that they will be, natural cheaters. And I would encourage a counter narrative to that, that our students are here to learn. So I'll get off that soapbox for now. When we talk with our students, one of the things that we can do that I think so many of our faculty members don't do is talk with your students about academic integrity. Talk with them explicitly about it and let them know what your expectations are. And at the same time, we've talked on our campus a lot about starting from a place of trust. This is a message that our provost has said publicly in updates about the COVID-19 crisis. And she said she wants to start us from a place of trust. So she actually went back to those academic integrity values before she wrote that speech. And also acknowledged that as we are madly trying to move online, our students are also undergoing amazing levels of stress at the moment. Stress can be one of the factors that can increase misconduct. If students feel they don't have any other choice, there's no other way they can cope except to make a poor decision, then that might tempt them when they might not otherwise be tempted, right? Some of your students will be caring for others, unable to be with their own families. And there is, again, sort of lots of research to show, I didn't put the citation here, but I can share it with you if you want, to show that, some of you will have heard Prensky's term from 2001 called digital natives. I know it's a contested term, but it will resonate with people, and that, digital natives can do anything. There's research to show that digital natives are good at a couple of things with technology. One is using technology for entertainment, gaming, movies, all of that thing, and the other is using technology for socializing. Digital natives are not digital online learners, and they do not necessarily have the skills to know what it takes to be a good online learner. We have a graduate program with 900 students in blended and online programs in education. And we spend a good deal of the first year with those students teaching them how to be online learners, because many of them don't know when they come in, or they assume that they will know and then find that it's a completely different world. So don't assume that your students are natural online learners. They may not have great time management skills. They may not know how to, of course they'll know how to download videos and that kind of thing, but they might not know how to manage their own time as they're managing a crisis, right? So those personal skills come into play as well. And students might not think to tell you that they don't know how to learn online because they may not be aware of it. And we're really talking on our campus about starting from a place of kindness, and when in doubt, be kind with students. And I will say that I used to be the most militant educator, when it came to deadlines. I would say things like, deadlines are there for a reason, and you have to learn to meet them. And deadlines are for everybody. And you're going to disrupt all of my grading processes if you pass your work in late, and you will lose marks. The more I did academic integrity research, the more I realized that my militance was actually encouraging students to make poor decisions when it came to academic integrity. So now I say to students, if it means the difference between asking for an extension for a couple of days and making a poor decision, and by making a poor decision, what I mean is don't outsource your work to an online third-party provider, or don't cheat off your friend, or something like that. Ask me for an extension, because students are here to learn. And I tell my students, I work with online students all the time, and I start my first session by saying, you're here to learn, and I'm here to help you. If you're not learning, I'm not doing my job. So if you find you get to a place where you need to ask for something to help ensure you're learning, then ask for it and let's have a conversation. And I've learned to be a lot gentler with my students as I delve deeper into the academic integrity work. So take a little pause there. Katie, any questions?
Yeah, sure. There is actually a couple.
Okay.
Let me just get myself organized. So one of them is just about, well, quite a few of them are about this idea of building a culture of integrity within classrooms and doing that in an online environment, especially in terms of things like how the idea is communicated to students that knowledge is more important than grades. And also, which is a huge question, and also about student concerns about their peers and their perceptions that their peers are cheating, and kind of how instructors can deal with those concerns that students might have.
Okay, great questions, big questions for sure. As I'm going through my mental Rolodex of research articles I've read, that sometimes students' perceptions of their peers cheating doesn't actually align with what their peers are actually doing. If students think their peers are cheating more, they may feel compelled that they have to cheat in order to keep up. It's a phenomenon known as cheat to compete. Again, sort of bringing in that conversation around we're all here to learn. And in terms of the grades, that's actually a tough one because it depends a little bit on the grading situation that you have in your institution, right? I didn't talk about that when I talked about working within existing systems and structures. Like last week at the University of Calgary, for example, we had a shift where students could now choose at the end of their winter semester whether they want to go with the traditional grading system or whether they want to choose a pass-fail or incomplete. And that was new for us. So many of us will be trying to figure, okay, how do I manage that? What does it look like for students to have choice? I've seen an ongoing protest on social media against that. And be that as it may, this is kind of the reality that we're working in. And so these are some of the institutional decisions that are beyond me as an individual instructor, but I got to work within them. And I figure now is not the time for me to be, saying anything against my university administration. I actually think they're doing a great job, but they're also trying as best they can in a situation they haven't faced before. So it might depend a little bit on the situation you're in with your own grading, but I'll encourage you to keep asking the questions and I might get some more ideas as we go through the session.
Okay, and I just have one other question, Sarah. Sean O'Neill asks about if you have any suggestions about research to read in regards to building a culture of academic integrity in online environments, especially for students that are used to face-to-face.
Maybe not. Yes, actually. So I'm going to write it here. A couple of books. Katie, if you know them, it's McCabe, Butterfield, and Trevino's 2012 book, Cheating in College. That's one. Wendy Sutherland Smith's book, it's dated, it's from 2008, but it's like plagiarism in the internet. Really good stuff. In fact, one of the things I like most from Wendy Sutherland Smith's book is she presents sort of a model. It's about plagiarism, but it can be extended to other aspects of academic integrity. A model around, she's got intentional cheating at one end and unintentional plagiarism at the other end. And she aligns that with different pedagogical models. And she asserts, it's a model, it's not empirical evidence, but she asserts that, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the article in front of me, that in transmissionist models of teaching that are teacher-centric, kind of like this webinar, that are teacher-centric, that there might be more intentional cheating. But in transformational approaches to teaching and learning, where students are partners and that there's more dialogue back and forth, that there might be more unintentional plagiarism, but students are less likely to do it intentionally. That's her assertion. That's Wendy Sutherland Smith 2008 book. And I thought that was very interesting because in some disciplines we're very transformational, students as partners, co-creating rubrics, that kind of thing. And other disciplines, it's very much about I am the teacher and you are the student, and you will learn what I teach. And so it was interesting to me to kind of see that as a model out there. So in terms of books, articles, those are a couple that come to my head right away. Certainly McCabe, Butterfield, and Trevino's 2012 book, absolutely seminal, easy to read, widely available. You could get it on Amazon this afternoon. And McCabe's work is pretty seminal. Yeah.
Okay, I'll put those into the chat box. One other question, just a quick one. Is it a problem if people take screenshots and share them on Twitter?
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine. Yeah, in fact, please at me on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Sarah Eaton. Please include me. Yes, also somebody mentioned, thanks Jody, James Lang's book, Cheating Lessons. One of the things I love about James Lang book is that James Lang specializes, in that book anyway, on teaching in large classes. He teaches large lectures, and I loved his approaches to assessment for large lectures there. So thanks for that. That didn't tip me off when I was thinking about it, but yeah, that's another good book for sure.
Yeah,
okay.
So there's 2 Lang books in there that people can find in the chat box. And sorry, one other question just about how well this information can kind of also apply to K-12 contexts.
Yeah, I think a lot of it will. And I think for sure, I mean, we're going to get into some of this stuff around exams soon too, but I think that having those conversations with students, right, and that letting them know you care, things like giving them a little bit of flexibility. For those who are homeschooling their kids right now, I think it's really important to communicate to parents that their first job, of course, is to be parents, not police, and that you know, you don't need parents coming en masse, or the other way, you know, defending if there has been a misconduct. So that's probably a whole different webinar. But yeah, I think the principles of integrity, the foundations, the values, and how do you enact those in a way that makes sense in your particular educational context are things that we sort of puzzle through depending on where we work. I know that probably wasn't a concrete answer, but I hope it helps. So this one, I think we've already talked about that before. We want to avoid the moral binaries, right? And look at ways of how do we support our students, thinking about academic integrity as a developmental process, right? Just the same way that moral development, it is attached to moral development, but also skills, understanding institutional expectations and learning expectations, and understanding that the students are on this journey for a long time. In fact, I've seen some research that says that the academic integrity actually continues on, like for those who go into a career in higher education, through about the first 10 years of their professorship. So half the people are like on their way to retirement by then, but that they have to learn to translate academic integrity into research integrity, and that happens in the early stages of their career. So that was a sidebar, but might be useful to know that it's not black and white even for professors. Key message here, our students, I've heard so much narrative and dialogue around students, they're just automatically going to turn into cheaters. We want to start a discourse that we don't want to antagonize students. That is also in the research literature, that when students feel teachers don't care about them, they are more likely to cheat. So what we see is that when I care about my students care about learning. It's not necessarily a reciprocal relationship. It's not that I care about students and students care about me. It's that I care about students and students care about learning. And students care about learning ethically. So keep that in mind as well as you are engaging in those conversations with your colleagues as well. We really want to show students that we care about them as human beings, even if you're teaching a large class, right? So for the online assessment design, so I can tell that there's already some academic integrity advocates here, and this will not be news to you, but avoid those pre-published test banks from the publishers, and avoid using previous assessments. So we had Julia Christensen Hughes to our campus in 2017, and she framed it for us this way, that when we reuse assignments, it's like for students, we're sending a message that it's okay to reuse previous work. And for them, that means, well, why can't I go and use somebody's lab from last year or 2 years ago? Because you're using the same exam. So why wouldn't I use the previous labs? That if we want to model integrity for our students. And I know it's a lot of work to come up with new assessments every term, right? And I was at a research symposium at Athabasca University in Edmonton. It's a couple of months ago now, but someone there was telling me they'd been at a conference where there's a group in the United States who refreshes their assignments for their open learning every 2 weeks because it takes a matter of days for assessments to show up online. So if you're not familiar with the online file sharing sites, then you'll want to get familiar with them, because any test, any assignment, any quiz that you have created and posted anywhere online is available on a file sharing site. OneClass, Course Hero, etc. They're already there. And if they're not, there will be in a moment. And I will say that part of this, I mean, there's a lot of dialogue around file sharing, inappropriate file sharing. But students will share, and Rogerson and Basanta, they did a great chapter in the International Handbook on Ed Integrity in this, because remember, Napster was invented before many of our students were born. most of our students have been born into a sharing culture, and they don't necessarily understand why it's okay to share a meme, and it's not okay to share their last year's homework, particularly if it's their own work. The conversations around file sharing are bigger conversations than we can get to today, but it's not necessarily that students are being evil if they're file sharing their work. So I just kind of wanted to share that out there. But if you're not familiar with the file sharing sites, then I think it's incumbent upon you as an educator to get to know them. Key thing for assessment in online courses: stop asking students what they know, because they can Google it, they can find it in a second. Ask them how they know. So I'll give you an example. Actually, we'll go through some online things here in just a second. I'll share that anecdote then. So there's no such thing as a cheat-proof assignment. I've paraphrased the clean language from Dr. Kath Ellis in Australia, who says, we cannot design out student cheating, but we can sure as hell design it in. So we can look at examples of how we can design in ways for students to cheat. So poor assessment design can escalate student cheating. One of the worst things you can do right now is to have an unproctored multiple choice exam. So if you're like us and you work in an institution like the University of Calgary that is not going to be having Proctor U or any other online proctoring service, then multiple choice exams are a bad idea. Doesn't matter how many different versions of it you have, and our provost has actually said now in writing in a campus-wide email that she would like minimum of 24 hours for students to do all assessments. So having a 50-choice multiple choice exam that students have to do in 15 minutes, not cool. Our provost has already said don't do that. Take-home exams would be a better idea, open book exams. And the idea of doing makeshift proctoring through Zoom, well, I'm going to quote my colleague Darcy at the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning, who just says, golly, that's just not a good idea. So, trying to proctor students through Zoom and using your camera, it's not the same as an online proctoring service. Those are sophisticated online services. If I were to try and do this through Zoom, I could have, if I wanted to, had all my Post-it notes around my screen if I felt I needed those. So don't try and do makeshift proctoring through Zoom. You probably don't have the experience or the tools. The students can find ways around it if they want to. And for some students, knowing that they're being watched without having been told that will create crazy levels of stress unknown to them before. So just please avoid makeshift proctoring with Zoom, and also avoid the multiple choice exams. So that leads to the question of what can you do? We'll get there in just a section, but just a moment. Key message: because we have statements in our course outlines about academic misconduct, does not absolve us of the responsibility of talking to it about with our students all the time. I talk about it in the first day of class. I talk about it again. I talk about it when assignments are due. I tell students, if you want to have a conversation with me about your classes, I have my virtual office hours. Students can sign up to come chat with me. By the way, if you have office hours on campus, you might want to think about having virtual office hours through Zoom now. Talk with them about your expectations. When is it okay for them to collaborate? When is it not? We send students a lot of mixed messages around collaboration. We say, we're going to do this as a group assignment, mostly because it's less grading for us, but then we turn around and say, this is an individual assignment, you're not allowed to collaborate. So if you're going to make those distinctions with students, make it really clear under what circumstances are they allowed to work together and when are they not, because otherwise it's easy for students to get confused. Assessment criteria, right, that are fair, reflect what's actually been taught in the course, and that the number of assignments are reasonable. I've now heard of instructors doing tests and quizzes every day now because they've heard that smaller assignments, more frequent assignments are better, perhaps to a degree, but it doesn't mean you need your students up studying till 3 or 4 every night. Every morning because they've got a quiz every day. You also want to understand the notion of cognitive load for the students, right? We have a Student Success Center at University of Calgary. They moved all of their appointments online. I always like to advocate for the teaching assistants out there. Until recently, we've had very few conversations on our campus about teaching assistants. We now have a resource for them. Katie, you can put the resource up there if you have it. If not, we can send it out to everyone. It is not okay to ask students to investigate a case of misconduct, not at the University of Calgary anyway. That is firmly the instructor's responsibility. We can't ask them to gather all the evidence, etc. That is a responsibility of the instructor of record. It is also deeply unethical to ask a TA to ignore a case of misconduct, even if it's suspected. It's part of our job as professors to mentor those teaching assistants as future higher education professionals, teachers, etc., and that we might want to work with them to show them this is how we manage a case at our institution. So I think the principles for teaching assistants can be clearly articulated at different institutions as well, because they have been a largely neglected group on our campus. Okay, so for alternative assessments, I'll put the lists up there just to kind of give you some ideas. This is from our Taylor Institute, but I'll give you a couple of anecdotes as well while you're looking at the list. Focus on the last one on oral exams. So I did a session last week for our Department of Chemistry, and this idea of oral exams came up, and the chemistry profs were like, oh, we don't do oral exams in chemistry. And I have a background in second languages and literatures, so oral exams were part of my life as a student and as my professor. And the chem teachers dismissed oral exams. And I have to give a shout out to the TA, whom I only know by first name because she was part of the webinar, and her name was Millen. And so she chimed in and said, actually, I'm from India, and we had oral exams for chemistry there. So we had a little back and forth about how did those oral exams work for you in chemistry? And she said, well, you did your experiment and you had your lab book, and then you did your oral exam to explain how you knew the answers that were in your lab book. And I said, how long did it take? She said, it was about 5 minutes. Like, the professor can tell in about 5 minutes, do you know what's in your lab book, and how do you know it? And then we asked, how big are your classes? And she said, a couple hundred. And I said, did the TAs do those oral exams? And she said, no, the professors did. And people would sign up for their 5 minutes with their professor, and that oral exam was part of their whole project. And it related back to whatever experiment and whatever lab book that they had. And I thought, that's fantastic, because here she was, a chemist who had experience doing oral exams in her discipline in a different country. And it was absolutely fantastic. And I think by the end, a lot of the chemistry professors were convinced that they were going to do oral exams with their students. But it's a focus on not what they know, but how they know. And I'll tell you about an assessment that I had when I was an undergrad student that I thought was one of the best exams I ever had. I thought the professor was brilliant. Roger Crowther was his name, St. Mary's University, Renaissance and Restoration Literature, 4th year class. He knew his material better than anybody I knew. Every single student in the class got a different exam. And the exam was this. It was one line of text from our Norton anthology, and that was it. Everybody got a different line of text. Everybody got the same 4 exam questions. The questions were, who wrote it? When was it written? Where is it from? Those 3 questions were worth 25%. Who wrote it? When was it written? Where is it from? The next question was worth 75% of the exam, and it was, how do you know? And so there we were all writing pages and pages and pages. We couldn't ask each other because we all had different, it was one line. And we all had to write it down. And I remember that I got something with unique capitalization. I'm like, okay, yeah, you talked about this author having peculiar capitalization. I think it was a class in January. And then you wrote a couple of things on the board about how he had capitalized spring in this one passage. And I did okay on the exam because I also let him know that I'd been to class. And so that was an example of a very different individualized student assessment. And also he could only do that because he knew the material inside and out. So I'll kind of leave these up there. I'll take a little pause. I see we've got about 6 minutes left. How are we doing for questions, Katie?
There are a couple.
Okay.
Valerie has a question about institutional support when transgressions are found by instructors. So how can the institution support, I guess, the instructor, the students in general?
Okay, so there's a number of different ways support comes through. So one is, establish policies and procedures. UFC, we have policies and procedures which are institutional level, and then we have processes which are faculty level. And the processes are sort of the nuts and bolts around how do you report it, who do you report it to, what does reporting look like, are there reporting forms, those are developed at the faculty level. And then they're fielded up to an associate dean. So every institution will have sort of its own processes, I guess, of how they will deal with misconduct. In some cases, they'll go straight to a dean. In other places, they might go to an associate dean. At some places, they might go to an academic integrity office. We don't have an academic integrity office at the University of Calgary. For us, it goes first through, it's fielded up through a department level person if it's a departmentalized faculty, or straight to an associate dean. And the associate dean would decide if misconduct has occurred, and if so, then what an appropriate sanction would be. At the University of Calgary, we're very clear that individual professors, and especially not TAs, are not to impose any kind of punishment or sanction, that needs to be done at least in collaboration with an associate dean. So different institutions will have different processes around that. And we have done, I say we because I see some of my teammates here on the call, some work around comparing institutional policies about what does it look like at Canadian universities. So in terms of how can an institution support, there's lots of different ways that an institution can support, but things like actual process documents to help people figure out, okay, I see the policy, now what do I do with it? How do I implement it? The implementation documents are things that I think lots of people need, and if they exist, they're not always well communicated. So even asking your associate dean and department head, do we have this and where do I find it? And sometimes they're buried so deep in websites, they're hard to get to. Okay, thank you for that, Katie. You said we had a couple questions, or is there another one?
The other one was about conversations that the universities had about alternative assessments, but I think you've mostly covered that.
Okay, sure, I'll keep going then. So hopefully you're kind of getting some ideas and the wheels are turning for what you can do in your own class, and how you might be able to think about ways of assessing that you might not have thought either. I will say a couple of days ago, the chemist would not have thought about doing oral exams, but I was also able to, she was right there and willing to share this, teaching assistant who had experienced them. So that's made me think of something that we're not doing at the University of Calgary that I'd like to start doing, which is using local level experts. And by local level, I mean faculty and department level experts, and mobilizing them to help others in their discipline and their field. I have a lot of credibility in education and humanities because that's my background, but less so in disciplines like engineering and science because that's not my background. So I'm thinking about how do I partner with people in those fields in ways that make sense for them. And so that they can start rethinking things. And I feel for people who are trying to do hands-on courses in online learning, people who work in the trades, for example, or that there are other things that aren't necessarily hands-on. And if you have ideas that you're using at your institution, even nursing, I know we've got some nurses online here too, like how are you dealing with clinical practice in an online environment? What's that looking like for you? If you want to go ahead and share your ideas or questions, then please do that, because I think we have a lot to learn from each other. A key piece of this is anecdotal, but I think it's really important to mention as we're focusing on kindness and compassion for our students as well. Lancaster and Clark, Thomas Lancaster and Robert Clark coined the term contract cheating. It used to be called term paper mills. Those have existed for decades. But Clark and Lancaster were computer scientists, and they found academic outsourcing, students were outsourcing coding assignments to online providers, and came up with this term contract cheating that's meant to refer to academic outsourcing in a variety of disciplines. When we had Tracy Bertag to our campus last year, she had done some research with her colleagues in Australia to show that all kinds of assignments can be outsourced, including things like teacher practicum reflections. How you can outsource an assignment like that is beyond me, but they found evidence that such things can be outsourced. We have seen worrying, anecdotal, but worrying evidence that these predatory commercial providers are out there and they're ready to prey on our students, as our students are also undergoing highly stressful situations. we've seen an increase, anecdotal but nevertheless existent, in the amount of social media advertising and marketing to these students, and it's often framed as homework help, and they'll help students. And we communicate very clearly, companies don't care about students. Educators care about students. There is an article that just came out actually that talked about the blackmailing aspects of some of these companies and how they work. So students will pay, and if students don't pay for an essay or whatever, an assignment to be completed online, or they don't continue to pay, then the companies will report them to the schools. This is a completely different sort of side of this. We won't have time to go into too much detail about it, but I want to tell you that it's real. It's not sensationalist, it's hyperbole. It's estimated to be $1 billion industry. And those companies operate on a global level in all disciplines. Probably less so in things like performing arts, but very much so in anything where there's text, and where there's anything written down, whether that text is prose, computer code, reflections, creative assignments. If it can be outsourced, there's a provider, there's a supplier out there willing to take students' money for this. And I think this is, it's important to talk to students that they're here to learn and we're here to help them. And if they're not learning, we're not doing our job. Because these companies don't care about students. No matter how much they frame it as help, it's not. It's about lining their pockets. So just like we've seen things around price gouging for hand sanitizer on Amazon, for example, there are predators out there. And I will actually say to my students, I will have conversations with them. Some of them don't think that I know about this. As a professor, they're like, you know about these companies? I'm like, yes, I do. And I don't want you to use them. So if you need, I'd rather give a student more time to submit their assignment than have them feel they have to go to a provider, a supplier, because they have no other choice, right? And Katie, we have the, yes, you should put in the chat box there, the strategies to detect contract cheating. There are other resources out there, but if you think your student has outsourced their assignment, then we also have, I think we have how to have a discovery interview with students around basically an oral interview. In some places they call it a viva, to find out has the student really done their own work, because we'll need to know that. But I wanted to make you aware of that in case you're not aware that this is a major commercial industry, and they're ready to prey on our students. And I think our job as educators is not, when we're upholding integrity, part of this is protecting our students. We have some self-service resources there. While they were created specifically for the U of C, so these were resources that I'd come up with for and pulled together for the workshop when it was face-to-face. Katie's already put a couple of them in the chat box. You might find them useful. The new website, Alternative Online Assessments, and the new website, Academic Integrity and Online Learning, might be transferable to your respective institutions, and you might find things that you can use or share with your own colleagues, etc. Katie, could you maybe put up the links there in the chat box so people can access them? I think you've got most of them up there. And these are things that we're putting together for our faculty and our teaching assistants to help them as they're transitioning during this crazy crisis right now. So students are not exempt from following the policies and procedures, but we're also trying to adapt and ensure that we're still maintaining quality, right? It's not that we throw quality out the window or learning quality, and we want to continue to support students. And we have a campus mental health strategy, so we are obliged to take into account the mental health impacts of COVID-19 on our students as we're helping them to learn and complete their courses. And I don't know if I shared it with everybody. At the University of Calgary, we got our official notice yesterday that all of our spring and summer courses will be delivered online, regardless of the situation development about the virus itself. So this will give people who are teaching spring and summer an opportunity to prepare their classes. We'll have a little bit of time to catch our breath and hopefully have some deeper conversations around how to improve the classes, because we've basically had an emergency response, an emergency teaching and learning response. But this will be ongoing for us as we continue to help our students in the next 2 semesters. We don't have any word yet about the fall semester, but we know for sure, regardless of what happens, all classes for spring and summer will be remote and online. So that was the sort of the formal portion of the slides, and I'd like to open it up for any questions or comments that we have now. Katie, did we have other questions that came in?
Nothing specific, just a few comments about strategies about recognizing student engagement rather than just the results of what they've learned. There's been discussion about ungrading in the chat, so I don't know if you want to jump on that and talk a little bit about it, or if you want to open the floor to other questions. There were a few people that had some general questions at the beginning, and I kind of asked them to hold on to them because I felt like they would be addressed within the meeting. But if people still have them or want to clarify them, I think this would be a great time for that as well.
Yeah, I think so. And we didn't use mics through the session, but if anybody wants to have a sort of open mic time, we can do that now. I welcome your reflections, your insights, your wisdoms. This certainly doesn't cover everything, but I wanted to, use it as a point of departure for further conversation. And while I'm at it, I can let you know that one of the things we're starting at the University of Calgary, I don't have the details to put in the chat box now, but you can certainly email me if you like, is next Monday morning. We're starting a weekly integrity hour, which is a drop-in virtual coffee session where there won't be slides, there won't be a presentation, but people can come and ask questions in a safe environment. It's designed for educators, and that's professors and teaching assistants, and they can ask questions or puzzle through things, get ideas from other people, ask for suggestions, and we're opening it up to other educators. Right now, I say educators, I mean people who are working in either higher education institutions or K-12. So if that's something you'd like to join in, we will keep it limited to people who are working actively at educational institutions. But if that's something you'd like to join in, then send me a private email, and then I can, from your institutional email address, please. And then I can let you know, and you're welcome to join our integrity hour or have your own integrity hour at your own institutions. Ours is for our University of Calgary campus, plus anybody else who wants to drop in and just be part of our campus community of integrity that we're building. So yeah, that we're having integrity hour once a week for the next 4 weeks for as long as people need and want the support, and we may continue with it after that, but this is just a chance for folks to come and in a very, very low-key environment, share, connect, create, and continue to create community with one another for people that are interested and committed to this topic.
Okay, Sarah, I see on the chat that Nick Chang has a question about why multiple choice questions are a bad idea for online exams.
Oh, well, pretty much for the same reason that I said at the beginning in terms of what you could do with my slides. You can easily take a screenshot of those slides and then drag and drop that screenshot into a Google folder where the next student can look through those questions very easily, and then students can whether you've got that carousel, it only takes 2 seconds to do a screenshot, and then those can be dropped into an online folder within 5 seconds. So an entire exam could easily be in a Google folder within a minute or two. It takes a lot less time to share the questions than it does to create them. Does that help?
I did get one question just about whether or not multiple choice questions can be changed to become critical thinking questions, and if you have any comments about those. So this individual has a database that they've built up over many years with a lot of different questions that they don't want to lose.
Okay, so I guess one of my questions there, would there be any harm in giving that as a take-home exam? Where students could consult the materials and have time to reflect and think, what's the advantage of having it as an exam without the use of resources? And I don't know the person, I don't know the material, I don't know where the question came from. Those are things that are occurring to me. If it can be done as a take-home exam with an added question around, how do you know what you know? Then that might be a very useful adaptation of that material for an online environment. Again, kind of thinking off the top of my head, and I'll invite others who have expertise in assessing with integrity to chime in there. Um, I think, I mean, the other thing is, if you have developed a test bank, to be honest, your test bank is probably online already, and the students probably already have access to the questions. So how do you keep the focus on learning for those students, and how do you know that your current group of students is focused on the learning? And ways to incorporate the reflection and the how do you know piece is, I think, really key. So I'm thinking off the top of my head there, but I'll also invite other input from folks in the virtual room. And to answer Ray Ross's question, yeah, it would be the same for any exam. I think multiple choice for sure, because it's really easy to just Google the answers that way. Yeah. For the time, limit the time per question, keep it sequential. Potentially, I think one of my problems with multiple choice questions is, are you really getting at the deep learning? Like, how do you know students have really internalized the content? So I had a conversation with somebody who teaches anatomy. I think it was anatomy. It was something in the health sciences at U of C. And like, well, they need to know anatomy. And so we kind of puzzled through another kind of potential assessment. And it was, what if every student in the class got a different injury? That was their exam. And they had to identify what would be the part of the body that would be affected, and all of the basic anatomy that or the related anatomy, whether it was bones or tendons or anything that would go along with that, and then what would be the recommended treatment protocol. And if every student got a different, maybe it wasn't anatomy, maybe it was a different health sciences course, a different thing, then they would have to know the entire body anatomy, because they wouldn't know what they would be getting as an injury, and that might mimic what they would be getting if they were in a clinical situation. They wouldn't know who was coming in with what kind of injury. So it wasn't a regurgitation of anatomy or treatment protocols. It was this is what you've got, how would you deal with it, how would you know, and how do you know the anatomy that's related to it. So that was something that I was just brainstorming. I'm not saying it would necessarily work, but it was this kind of back and forth and puzzling things through with someone and saying, what in that case, what would be what would the students be likely to encounter in their practice exams. If your questions were developed into your LMS, well, if the students can take screenshots, then they could be on the internet. For those of you, I want to ask those of you who are still in the room, is there anybody here who used to do a lot of multiple choice exams that's moved to something else, particularly if you teach large classes? What have you moved to, and what do you find that's working for you? I do actually, Valerie, I really like your point around multiple choice evaluations being good for formative assessments. I would agree with that. To help students kind of rapidly identify gaps or deficiencies in their knowledge so they can then go back and improve it, with formative assessment being, of course, something that's not graded, and that they can use it as a learning tool to improve. It's when we try and create when the assessments are high stakes. Oh, thanks for that, Yvonne. Podcast, e-portfolios, visual essays. Can you maybe, could I ask you to say, what's a visual essay and how have you done it? Would you be willing to take the mic and talk about that? Or maybe put it in the chat box?
Hi, Sarah, it's Yvonne. Can you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so in our courses, we really have tried to move away from sort of the standard term papers and to bring meaning to our students. So what we've done, I'm thinking about the Indigenous Education, a call to action program. We've had students go out and take original photos. So we asked them to go out and metaphorically represent their role in reconciliation. So they have to go out and capture an image, and they're not graded on their photos, but they are then asked to take that photo and to develop it into a representation of their learning. And so it is very focused on self in relation to the concept, in this case, reconciliation. And it's not a lengthy essay, but about 3 to 4 pages. But what we find is having to marry the creative aspect with the more analytical, critical thinking allows for a really I think a stronger sort of representation or demonstration of deep learning. So that's our visual essay.
And how many students do you have in one of those classes?
So in our Indigenous education, we use D2L alongside face-to-face, which then in the fall and winter has moved to fully online. But we have had from 15 to 24 students in those classes.
Okay, that's helpful. I really appreciate that. Thank you, because that's a very creative way of having students engage deeply in the learning. And I like how you added in the critical thinking and the reflection, and that they're building their knowledge in a different way that's not just about regurgitating facts. And I saw also some chat around team-based assignments and group exams. I'm wondering if there's anybody who's done those who might be willing to offer some comment to others on the call. Okay, yeah, please go ahead, Karina.
Hi. Yeah, so I've done some large classes of a couple hundred students in the past, and it was entirely online. And I don't have TAs where I work, so we have to do it entirely on our own. And the exam was originally based as multiple choice, but if somebody else had developed it, and I was just required to facilitate it, and then I decided that I was going to go off and move it to less marking. And so I started creating short answer questions, and I put the students into like breakout rooms, and they would work as in breakout rooms and come up with answers to the questions, and then they would submit it as one single exam, and then all 4 students would get the same grade, and then they could grade each other on their participation. And then I would take that participation mark and put that in with the grade that they got on the exam.
And okay, can you maybe offer your reflection? First of all, maybe tell folks, what do you teach? And then how was that in terms of teaching and assessing for you? Like, how did it work?
So I teach geomatics engineering, and it's so it's very, very technical, and so the platform is in D2L, so we use that as well. And so the students, this would be a final exam that I get them to do this. And so it's very technical questions. It's very much around the process, modeling, creating models. And so my questions, instead of saying like very specific things like in this scenario, which of these things would you choose? It was now, here is an application, and now explain to me the process as to how you would get to an answer. And then they'd have to work together to come up with that for a long answer.
And Valerie's got a question for here. What did the students think of the format and evaluation, and what was it worth? What was the assignment worth?
The final exam is worth 20%. That we're not allowed to have anything higher than that. So, but the feedback that I got from the students was that they loved it. They actually thought it was great. I actually saw that the grades went up, and because it was so much of a process-based exam rather than being like something that they could expect, like they really knew what was coming. They couldn't really take a screenshot and share it. They were allowed to have open book. They were allowed to have any materials that was available. Previously on the multiple choice, it was still open book. So the questions were framed just so that they could use resources, just more critical thinking. But I've definitely found that the students had much less stress, and they really, really liked it. So now they keep asking me to do it with all my exams, even my face-to-face guys now.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and you said you had large classes for that, like how many?
The first, that class particular is a online GIS class, and it was about 200 students that year.
And how, for you, from an instructional point of view, how is the marking load for you, the grading load?
It was huge beforehand. Now that I've reduced it down to really 50 exams rather than 200, it's been a lot easier. It took me a little bit of time to figure out a process just to mark it, but I look for keywords, I look for key elements within what they're giving me. And if they've got that, then I know that they know what they're doing.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. And I really appreciate that that was for an online class as well. I think that those concrete examples, and I know Yvonne, I think, had to step out, but she was also teaching in an online class. So I wanted to open up the floor for the others who have experience teaching in online environments to ask what are you doing, or what have you done that has worked? And I don't mind sharing another example. One of the classes that I've taught for our MEd program is language learning and technology. And I do it as a project-based course, so there's no final paper in the course, mostly language teachers who take the course. And so in the beginning, I have to do a bit of an introduction on D2L, tell me about themselves and what they teach. And then I introduce concepts around TPAC. It's a technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge sort of framework, and I ask them to think about themselves and where is their strengths within the TPAC framework. Many of them will say they don't have technology as a strength. And as I do this, I get to know them. Sometimes that class has been pretty big, like up to well, for language, so for master's level class, like up to 32, I think I've had in that class. And then as I'm getting to know them, I'm also getting to know what language they teach, where they teach, and they want to tell me about themselves. I'm like, okay, so the next step is you're going to design something using technology. And by the way, we're not just going to use gadgets. They have to understand sort of teaching with technology as pedagogy, not as gadgetry, and then they build something that they can use. They have to think about the constraints within their educational context. So do they have privacy laws they have to adhere to? And and many of them will end up building websites or wikis or something like that, but they build it. And I say, please build something that you can go back into your actual classroom and use in the next semester. Some of them end up doing it, and some of them end up not being able to do that for a variety of reasons, but to think about what is something they can actually apply. And because it's a master's level course, we also have to do a lot of reading around theory, around pedagogy. What does it mean to teach and learn online? We look at computer assisted language learning, mobile assisted language learning, and then we build in a lot of the theory around it. And by the end, they've done a ton of reading, but they've also created their own project and demonstrated how the readings and the theory applies to their project. So that was one for language learning at a master's level. Other ideas out there or things that folks have used that have actually worked really well in your online classes?
Hi, Sarah. There was one question a little bit earlier about how to grade with a really large class online and to get away from multiple choice. And I actually had a couple suggestions because I teach a course with 60 students. It's online and it's a writing course. So I know it's not as huge as some of the other courses that people teach. But because it's a writing course, I don't use multiple choice. It's all things that students write. And so what I do is in the LMS, so in D2L, I embed the rubric with the assignment, and it makes it a lot easier to grade. So I just go into the Dropbox and I can make comments on student writing. I can put their marks in the rubric. It automatically adds it all up and puts it right into the grade book. So those little steps kind of help. I actually find that it doesn't take any longer than if I were grading like printouts. But if I download them all and tally them myself and then try to send them back to the students, that takes so much longer. So for these, I really use the features within the learning management system.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And Valerie's asked her, how do you or did you work with international students who may be stressed by having to speak? I've actually been in that situation because I did my master's degree in Spanish. So I've been in that situation, not as an international student, but as a second language student who had to perform in my second language for oral exams, including my master's examinations. Yeah, incredibly stressful. I can speak from experience. Yeah, through the roof, right? And for me, speaking as somebody who did that work in a second language, I found a kind of sort of cognitive paralysis where I could not recall the information in my second language because I was so busy trying to think it through. And I recall times when people would say things like, it's okay, take your time. We have time. and they would kind of create a space where I could breathe. And if I couldn't recall it, then just kind of go back, you know, kind of we'll go on to the next one. It's okay. We'll come back to it later on. By then I may have recalled the knowledge. But remember, you're not there to test their English unless, of course, you're teaching English as an additional language, but you're asking about the content. And if somebody does come up with that sort of cognitive paralysis, then give them a chance to breathe, work through their exam anxiety, create a safe space for learning, conversation, and they might end up needing some kind of accommodation that you might need to go through your learning assistance offices for. I think some of it can be managed through care and compassion and patience, and letting students know that they're not going to fail if they mess up with their English. So you're not going to be the grammar police. You want to know how they know and give them a chance to showcase their learning. I think that in my experience, reflecting on my experience as a learner, that helped me a lot when I was a second language learner. I would say at our school, would we have translators as accommodations? I think that would be handled through our accessibility services office. I think in some cases, perhaps, particularly for the deaf and hard of hearing students, but I don't know, and I don't know about resourcing at U of C. Yeah, and I'm not sure what it's like at other schools. If others have experience, I would be glad to hear it. Okay, we're almost 90 minutes into our call here, so I think what I'll do is I will say thank you for joining us today. I hope this has been useful. If it has been, I wouldn't mind, I would actually love a chat or a reflection about, did you have any key takeaways? Did you learn anything new? Did you get any ideas? What are you thinking about? What are you going to talk to people about in the next virtual meeting that you have? What questions do you still have? Do you want more webinars? Like if you're at U of C and you're part of our learning community in particular, what's the next thing we should be doing a webinar on? And if you want to know about the virtual coffee hour, you're welcome to come and join us if you're working at an educational institution. I hope this has been useful. I hope I wish you all the best with online learning and teaching. I know you are doing the best that you can, and I trust you to engage your students with learning with integrity the best that you can, and I trust that everyone is doing the right thing right now as best we can. So thanks everyone for being here, and we'll make the recording available to everyone as quick as we can. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye.